Hello, friends. I've got right here what you will need to write to me and ask for your own worksheets. If you write to me and put in the subject line keys for keys to dynamic Bible study, and ask me, I will put you on my list. That way, you will get the YouTube as well video as well as the worksheets that you'll need to follow, and you will quickly realize that 99% of my study has to do with the text. We will be looking at the text, studying that text, because that text is inspired by the Holy Spirit. And it is that text that affects our lives. That text that affects our lives in such a way that our lives are changed. Okay, so it's Barbara Arnold 47 at gmail.com. Write to me and ask for the worksheets to be sent to you as well as the YouTube every single week that I teach. Thank you. It's good to be here with you. We're going to have an exciting lesson today. And this lesson is going to entail lots of questions on my part, questions about the text. What you'll need to do is answer those questions. Now, I might not give you enough time to answer them on your own. So here's what you do. Have ready that pause button so that when I give you the question and tell you where to look, you pause it and you look at that area and you find the answer. And then you unpause it, come back to me, and I'll have another question. These questions will get you to think about the text, you to consider what Jesus is saying to you. Okay, so we have been doing all along a lot of narrative type scenes. We talked about this last week, didn't we? A lot of scenes that are connected to each other, though they're separated by many, perhaps many chapters. But last week and this week, what I wanted to do was to show you some things that are that have to do with context. When we look at context, we are doing exactly what scholars do. They look at the text, they look at the story, but they look on either side of that text, and they look what is being said. So that means I'm doing a little bit more of a chronological order, even though I'm going back to through Jesus's trek toward Jerusalem. So here's what I want you to do. We're going to go on your worksheets or in your Bible to chapter 12. We're going to read on your worksheet the left-hand column, 12, 13 to 21. And we're going to discuss that. And like I said, I'm going to be asking questions for you to think about, because that's what Jesus wanted his hearers to do. He wanted them to think of what he was talking about. So we have a story about Jesus. He's in the midst of crowds. Now you got to understand, the crowds are heavy. Sometimes the disciples have to make a way for Jesus to go along a path, because there are thousands who are following him and listening to him. His words are life itself, and they want to hear what he has to say. And so these crowds are around him. So the author wants you to picture in your mind Jesus being jostled by this mob scene and being approached as a rabbi in order to settle a dispute about the family estate. So let's go in and read it. And I'm going to read it with you. Luke 12:13. Someone in the crowd said to Jesus, "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." But Jesus said to him, "Man, who appointed me a judge or arbitrator over you?" Then he said to them, the crowd, including this man, "Beware and be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does his life consist of his possessions." And he told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, 'What shall I do, since I have no place to store my crops?' Then he said, 'This is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years. Come, take your ease. Eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared?' So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." Well, let's go back and take a look at what's going on. This man, uh, it looks as though the way he speaks and the inheritance that he's talking about makes this man look more like a rich man than a poor man. I mean, the rich could order people about, including rabbis, couldn't they? Because they had the money to swagger and act the way they wanted to. And that's exactly what he does, doesn't he? "Teacher, tell my brother to divide the family inheritance with me." No question, no humility, just a demand from a teacher. Now, the laws of inheritance were pretty good in Torah. There were two places, Numbers and Deuteronomy, that gave those laws for inheritance. But as usual with laws, there were extenuating circumstances. Even the laws that we wrote down, 200 years ago, over 200 years ago, 200, wow, a lot of years ago. We made laws, didn't we? But on top of those laws, another circumstance came up, and we had to add a law to cover that circumstance, and add a law to that law, and add a law, and add a law, and add a law. So that today, when people strive to be lawyers, they have to memorize and know books upon books upon books upon books of laws upon laws upon laws. Same thing was happening back then. God gave laws for inheritance, but what happened? Extenuating circumstances. And therefore, they needed the rabbis to tell them what they should do about these extenuating circumstances. And that's what this man comes to Jesus for. "You're a rabbi, you're a teacher. Tell my brother." What tells you that this man's main problem is greed? Okay, look at the text, look at the story, and think about it. What tells you that this man's main problem is greed? Now, if you need time, just do the pause button. Well, the reason is that Jesus goes on with a parable about what? Greed. He's thinking about greed. And greed is very prevalent, so prevalent that Jesus gives two orders concerning greed. The first is beware. The second is be on your guard. Yeah, greed is so prevalent, so sneaky, so insidious that it creeps in when you're unaware, when you don't even realize that you're being greedy. I bet this man wasn't thinking that he was being greedy. He just wanted justice, didn't he? That's what he was thinking. Not the kind of justice that the widow a few weeks ago went to the judge for. Not that kind of justice, the right kind of justice. Please help me kind of justice. But this is a not just, this is concerning greed. And Jesus says, beware, doesn't he? Be on your guard. And then he goes on and talks about a parable concerning greed. Greed. And that's why we can know that Jesus thought of this man as not needing help, but being greedy himself. So, we have this greedy man and a parable about a greedy man. So let's look. What is the truth about possessions that Jesus teaches in verse 15 that prepares us for the parable that starts in verse 16? What is the truth about possessions in verse 16 that prepares us for the parable in verse 16? Well, here it is. For not even when one has an abundance of possession does life consist of his possessions. So, what is he saying? Life does not consist of possessions. That's not the main purpose for life, to accumulate possessions. Now, there are two levels of this word, for this word life. It could mean your physical and emotional and mental life, right? That's one level. So even on that level, your life does not consist of possessions. But there's another level in the book of Luke, the level of spiritual life or salvation life. So possessions are not to rule our spiritual life. Our spiritual life is more than our possessions, is what he's saying here. And what is the chief adversary of our salvation or spiritual life? Possessions. That's what he says. Possessions. Now, whenever you hear, remember what I said, whenever you hear me ask a question, put it on pause and think about the answer, because I'm going to give the answer. Then you can put it back and see if your answer and my answer conform. Now, who is this parable for? Well, it's about a rich man, isn't it? So in these crowds and crowds of people, this mob scene of people, we have some rich. Now try to understand that most of society in Jesus's day was dirt poor, but there were those who were rich, and those who even were filthy rich, as we learned about the rich man and Lazarus. We learned that there were rich men who had multiple, just loads and loads of money. And right now, Jesus, although he's speaking to the whole crowd, he's directing his attention and his sermon to the ones who are rich, isn't he? Because that's what the parable is all about, a rich man. But even though the parable is directed toward the rich, greed is not limited to the rich, as Jesus will go on to talk about. Greed is also a part of the life of the poor. So I'm going to ask you a question. In what way can the poor be considered greedy? Think about it. Put it on pause if you need to. In what way can the poor be greedy? Well, they can be craving for more. What is greed? A craving for more. Now, in Colossians 3:5, open your Bibles to Colossians 3:5. This craving for more, this greed, or the Bible also uses that word that's for greed. It also can be translated covetousness, coveting. This greed, this coveting, is also called something else. And let's look at Colossians 3, verse 6. Excuse me, verse 5. Therefore, consider the members of your earthly body, your body, as dead to immorality, as dead to passion, as dead to evil desire, and as dead to greed or covetousness, which amounts to idolatry? How in the world could greed be considered idolatry? That means that we're idolaters, doesn't it? When we want something so badly that we think about it, that we plan for it, that our whole mind is wrapped up in it, that we worship it. Or at least put the time that should have been thinking about God and His Word and thinking about the thing we want so badly. It's idolatry. Kind of scary, isn't it? We do it all the time. We want something so badly, something that's not ours, something that belongs maybe to God or to others. We want it so badly that we dwell on it, we think about it, we crave it because we don't have it. The poor have that problem, don't they? Now, let me talk about this poor in Jesus' day, because it's going to help us to understand about ourselves. The poor in Jesus' day were most of the people. And the poor lived on a subsistence level. Do you know what that means? That means they lived day to day, needing food for that day. They didn't know if they might have food for tomorrow. They just knew that they needed food for today. Just like in the Lord's Prayer, give us this day our daily bread. For most of us, we don't have to pray this week, do we? This way, do we? We just know that the income that we have is going to give us enough money for the kinds of foods, even donuts, desserts, and sugary cereals. I mean, we just go out and we just buy what we want, don't we? What we need. But these people did not have that. Most of their diet consisted of bread. Bread in the morning, bread for lunch, bread in the evening. They might, and the word is might. We've talked about this, haven't we? They might have a few vegetables, a few, maybe a fruit or a part of a fruit in order to supplement the bread. So when Jesus is talking here to these people, keep this in mind. The rich who had a surplus and so much money that they could banquet all the time, like the rich man in the story of the rich man and Lazarus. The poor could barely survive. And if there was a drought, they did not survive. What else can the poor do that shows that they can be greedy also? Well, what they dwelled upon in their minds. I was looking at listening to some people and looking on Facebook and the things that we dwell on when we don't have anything to dwell on. What things do we do? We think, wow, wouldn't it be great if we had hit the lottery? Now, many of you Christians don't even buy any tickets for the lottery. Good thing. Uh, but some of you think, well, what if I, you know, did? And you dwell on what you would do with that money. Even if it's good stuff, that dwelling on the money that you don't have is still dwelling on something that is not yours. Wanting it, craving it, even if it's to do some good. Oh, we all know stories about what people have done with that money. So many of those people wasted their money so quickly because of their wants and their greed. But we would be different, wouldn't we? So many of the poor think and dwell on what they could do. Did you ever hear that the people who are poor waste a lot of their money on lottery tickets because that's what they dwell on, isn't it? Are we dwelling on it? Are we dwelling on what could be if we just got some money? If a rich uncle would just leave us some money, what we would do? Yeah, I'm sorry, but you're probably more spiritual than I am. And you probably have never done that. I have. I have to confess. And what I had to learn to do was replace those thoughts with God thoughts, with prayer for others. We can't be wasting our time. Prayer is such, it should be like breathing for us. So why are we wasting our time on thinking about riches or the things we don't have? And then the poor think about illegal ways, some of them, small part of the poor, illegal ways of obtaining money. Some of the poor, not many, but some. How can I get away with this? How can I get more? I want more. So rich and poor have a problem with greed, don't they? He has a question, this person in the parable, this rich man in the parable, that's going to be critical in determining whether he has his mind on his possessions or is his mind oriented to God. Is his mind oriented to eternal life or is it oriented toward greed/idolatry? And the question is this in verse 17. What shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Oh my goodness. What shall I do? What should he do? I'll tear down the barns I have and build bigger ones. There's a problem with that. Let's look at who he's thinking about in all this. What I want you to do from verse 17 to verse 19 is circle all the pronouns. Let's do it together. I'm going to read it to you, and you circle every single pronoun in those verses. And it says this: what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Then he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods, and I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Even the you is directed toward himself. It's not a you outside of himself. Even the you shows how self-centered he is being. Now let's think about the next thing. What if he does build those barns? What if he does build those larger storehouses for himself? Well, let's think about that. How would withholding the produce hurt others? Well, let's think about it. The farmer has a lot of produce. What happens to the price of that produce? Down. In a good market, prices go down. Now let's think about that. Do you know that scientists are able to tell the rainfall in Israel 2,000 years ago when Jesus lived? I had never heard of anything like that, but they were able to. They were able to find out in the 3 years that Jesus was teaching, there was abundant rainfall. In fact, there was a 6-year period of abundant rainfall, so that the people could have looked around and said, oh, I know somebody just like the man in that parable. I know that rich man who did the same thing because there was so much rain. We can tell that there was a lot of rain even from a story in Mark. Let's go to Mark chapter 6. Mark chapter 6, 39. Mark chapter 6, 39. Now, when you get to chapter 6 and verse 39, you'll find out that this is a story about Jesus feeding the 5,000. Chapter 6, 39. And it's in the wilderness. They were in the wilderness. But look at verse 39 and see what it says. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. In the wilderness, green grass. It goes along with what scientists have figured out at that time. Plenty of rainfall. Enough rainfall for the wilderness to have green grass. Not dry, brown blades, but green grass. So, this man could have been any man in Israel who was wealthy. And they get all this produce. And he says, I'm going to put it in bigger barns, bigger storehouses. And what will happen to the poor? Well, the poor will have to pay the higher price, won't they? Because he's storing it away so that he can sell it for a higher price in the bad days and sell the produce today for the same old high price. Who does that affect? The poor. The poor. What should this man have done? You're right. He should have sold the produce for the cheaper rate in order to help the poor. Okay. He not only ignores God, he ignores his neighbor. So let's look what he continues to say in verse 19. Oh, take it easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. But God says, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? Who's the fool, according to Scripture? Oh, if you went to Psalm 14, verse 1, you'd find out that the fool was the one who says, there is no God. Now, this is a conversation between this man and this man. Yeah, and not once in that conversation did he say, there is no God. How did he say, there is no God? By not including God in any of his plans, by not loving his neighbor. So he, in reality, was acting as though there is no God. Now, this eat, drink, and be merry was a well known hedonistic phrase. It meant just live a lifestyle of just not caring about anything but your own pleasures. He forgot something, and you might have forgotten. Eat, drink, and be merry has another phrase that goes along with it. What is that? For tomorrow we die. He'd forgotten that, but God hadn't forgotten it. No, he hadn't. Because look what he says. This very night, your soul is required of you. When's this very night? Well, if you're thinking of the clock in the Hebrew mind, and he is talking to Jews, this very night is tomorrow. Because this very tomorrow starts with at 6 p.m. Yeah. Now we think 12 to 12, don't we? But it's theirs is 6 to 6. So 6 p.m. for the Jewish people is tomorrow. So when God said this very night, your soul is required of you, he was saying, tomorrow you die. Wasn't he? God remembered that. Now, there are two ways of being rich, according to that last verse that we read, verse 21. So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. Now tell me, what are the two ways of being rich according to this verse? Well, we can be rich with possessions, can't we? Or we can be rich toward God. Okay, so now we're going to read the second section, the top part of your right hand column, and that is from verses Luke chapter 12, verses 22 to 26. We're going to read that. And here's what I'd like you to do as we're reading it. I want you to circle two words. The first is worry. The second is consider. Okay, let's read. And he said to his disciples, for this reason, I say to you, do not worry. There it is. Worry about your life as to what you will eat, nor for your body as to what you will put on. For life is more than food, and the body more than clothing. Consider, remember that word, circle it, the ravens, for they neither sow nor reap. They have no storeroom or barn. He's hearkening back to the previous parable, isn't he? They don't have a storeroom. They don't have a barn. And yet God feeds them. How much more valuable are you than birds? And which of you, by worrying, can add a single hour to his lifespan? If then you cannot do even a very little thing, like adding an hour to your lifespan, why do you worry about other matters? Wow, this was shocking to me. I didn't realize worry was repeated so often here, and it's going to continue to be repeated. And I realized how much I worry, how much I get anxious, and how much I need to depend upon the Lord to give me the strength not to worry, to confess it even as a sin each time I do it, and to seek forgiveness from my Father, who forgives so easily and abundantly, even someone like myself who in the past has been a worrier. Okay? Jesus starts out with, for this reason I say to you. For what reason? Well, it harkens back, doesn't it, to verse 21, just right before it. See, context rules. So is the man who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. For this reason I say to you. For what reasons? For the reason that you want to be rich toward God. Since you want to be rich toward God, he says, do not worry. So if we're worrying, what does that tell us? We're not rich toward God, are we? Man, that shot at me. I just hadn't thought of that before. What does my worry do? It does nothing. Nothing at all. But look who he's directing this part of the story, his sermon to. The crowds are still there, the mobs are still there, but now he's talking to the disciples particularly, because he's talking to not the rich anymore, but to the poor. Now the crowds are still there. They're listening in to Jesus speak to his disciples, and the disciples are poor. They've left everything behind. They don't even have their jobs anymore. They've left everything and followed Jesus, haven't they? So they're amongst the poor. So that's why he's directing his attention now, his sermon, toward the disciples. They represent all the poor that are in the crowds, the mobs. So it's the opposite extreme. We're no longer have a sermon about the rich. We're having a sermon about the poor. And then he says, observe carefully, doesn't he? Consider the ravens in verse 24. Consider the ravens. What does consider mean? Observe carefully, closely. Watch them, study them. Do they sow or reap? No. Do they build storehouses? No. Yet what? Your heavenly God feeds them. God feeds them. Anyway, how much more valuable, he says, are you than the birds? It's saying that God cares for all the animals, but he also cares about you even more. Worry, 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 worry is impotent. Worry, worry, worry does nothing to give you any satisfaction, does not change anything, nothing at all. It just adds a burden. It takes away from our life even. Worry is one of the things that causes sicknesses. Any doctor will tell you the main reason for cancer or heart disease or any illness you have is worry. It's anxiety. It does nothing to bring you what you want. So we need to stop worrying, don't we? We need to listen to Jesus, don't we? We need to confess worry as a sin when we do it, don't we? Therefore in this little part that we just read is an example of worryless living? The raven doesn't worry, does it? It's got a worryless living in spite of the fact that it doesn't grow crops and doesn't build barns or storehouses. So let's go to the last section. And we have that word again, consider. That means to observe carefully, watch, look at it, lie out in a field and look at those lilies, because they didn't sow, they didn't toil, they didn't spin, did they? They didn't spin clothes for themselves, yet not even Solomon was dressed as well as any of those lilies that would be here today and gone tomorrow, or put in the furnace tomorrow. Now we have, let's read it. Consider the lilies, how they grow. They neither toil nor spin. But I tell you, not even Solomon in all of his glory clothed himself like one of these. But if God so clothes the grass in the field, which is alive today and tomorrow is thrown into the furnace. Ooh, there we have that word, tomorrow. It's thrown in the furnace. How much more? There it is again. How much more? How much more? How much more will he clothe you, you men of little faith? Now I want you to circle the word seek. It's 3 times in these next couple of verses. And do not seek what you will eat and what you will drink, and do not keep worrying. So he's put seeking for what you will eat and drink as synonymous with worry. For all these things the nations of the world eagerly seek, but your Father knows that you need these things. But seek his kingdom, and these things will be added to you. Do not be afraid, little flock, for your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. Sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourself money belts which do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven, where no thief comes near nor moth destroys. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. I could spend a whole lesson just on these words, couldn't I? Who are the 3 seekers? The first are those who seek their necessities. Remember, these are people who don't know where their next loaf of bread is coming from for tomorrow. So you would think they have a right to worry, don't you? And yet he still says to them, don't worry about it. How much less should we worry? Those of us who live in America who can make, how many of us are overweight because we have plenty, don't we? So we need to stop worrying even about necessities. The second group, the nations of the world. Those are the unbelievers. They seek, they worry. You're not to be like them, is what he's saying. And then the third group, those who seek the kingdom, Christ's kingdom. Those who seek that kingdom, who dwell on Christ's kingdom, who dwell on the things of God, who are rich toward God. Those seekers, they're not being told, don't worry, because they're not worrying. They've transferred worry over and seeking for their daily sustenance to seeking the kingdom. Did you notice something else? He says he starts calling God not God anymore, because he's been calling God God all along. God, God, God. Now he's speaking to those who seek the kingdom, and he's calling them children of God, or he's calling God Father, isn't he? He says, don't seek like the nations, but your Father knows that you need these things. And then again in verse 32, do not be afraid. Yes, life is uncertain, but do not be afraid, little flock, my sheep. For your Father has chosen gladly to give you the kingdom. Those of you who are believers, who are a part of Christ's kingdom, you don't have to be afraid. You don't have to worry. You have to seek the kingdom. It's the climactic moment when Jesus calls God Father, because that's intimacy. You're God's children. You're the Father's children. How much more is he going to take care of you than he took care of the ravens and the lilies of the field? And then the last part. We kind of get nervous about this in the book of Luke. It says, sell your possessions. All that means, doesn't say sell all your possessions. It says sell possessions. That means, let's put it in our language. Go to your checkbook, go to your savings account, and take some of the money out and give it to the poor. Yeah. Take some of your money out and give it to the poor. Now, what are you going to do if you're worrying about the next day's meal, or the electric bill, or the mortgage payment, or the taxes, or the meals that you need for your family, or the house you're living? What are you going to do with your possessions, your money? You're going to hold on to them. You're going to keep them close to you, and you're not going to open your hands out to give to the poor. That's what he's talking about here. Don't worry. Open your checkbook and give to the poor, because if I'm going to take care of your needs, you don't have to worry about it. So I say it again. Don't worry. Don't be afraid. Your Father in heaven will take care of you. And if you're not worrying, then the kingdom will come to you. God bless you. Good day.